Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating topic to dig into today, Seva Yoga. It's all about selfless service,
Yeah.
like as a spiritual practice. And we're going to be zeroing in on, like a really core principle within that, this whole idea of surrender. And it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, right?
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean? Like for you to actually surrender? Is it just like, doing what you're told, following instructions? Or is there something way, way deeper going on?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really the heart of it, right? That's
Yeah.
what we're going to be exploring. It's not about just blindly obeying. It's about a much deeper internal shift.
Right. It's about like the inner transformation, not just the outer actions. And I think that's where the real magic happens. Like when you start to actually embody that principle of surrender.
Absolutely. And we're going to be looking at, some really insightful stories and principles that can kind of illuminate what that really means and how it plays out in our lives, in very practical ways.
So this is like your personal deep dive right into the heart of surrender within this framework of Seva Yoga. So we're going to be like unraveling what's the difference between like, just complying and actually letting go completely and is there a path? Can you move from one to the other? And then, like, what are some practical ways to actually cultivate this in your everyday life? Your actions and the things you do.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's start with this really powerful story about building mud platforms. What's the story there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a classic story that I think really beautifully illustrates surrender. So there's this figure who wants to choose a successor, and they give their disciples this kind of unique task. They ask them to build mud platforms, and every time they build a platform, this figure deems it, inadequate, and they tell them to tear it down and rebuild it, often in a different location.
Oh, wow. So like you're putting all this effort into something, like physically building it, and then you have to tear it down and start over. Um, that sounds so frustrating. Have you ever been in a situation like where you're given a task and you're just like, why am I doing this? What's the point?
Yeah, and that's exactly what many of the disciples in the story, they experienced that frustration. And they started to think that, maybe this figure, perhaps because of age, had lost some clarity of thought. And so many of them abandoned the task. They just felt like it was futile and a waste of effort. Even those who initially persisted, eventually gave up after repeatedly building and demolishing these platforms, over and over again.
So pretty much everyone reached their breaking point, it sounds like. And that's where this one disciple, right, stands out.
Exactly, yeah. There's one disciple who's unique in their perseverance. And even as the others ridiculed them, saying like, "Oh, you're both, you and the figure are acting irrationally," this disciple continued to rebuild the platform, not just a few times, but 70 times.
70 times. Wow. So what do you think fueled that level of dedication? Like when everyone else saw this as just pointless repetition, what was driving this one person?
Well, they had this unwavering faith, this deep, absolute belief in the wisdom of this figure, even when it defied logical understanding. And there's a famous saying attributed to them where they said, if the Sekguru can see, then the whole world is blind. And
Wow.
this disciple saw themselves as a humble servant, fully committed to fulfilling the guide's wishes, even for their entire life, if that's what it took. They trusted completely in the grace of this figure.
And how did this figure how do they respond to this like incredible level of commitment?
Well, the figure was deeply pleased. They recognized this disciple's implicit obedience and complete surrender to their will. So they embraced the disciple and bestowed spiritual blessings upon them. And then turning to the other disciples, the figure pointed out that while they had initially followed instructions, they lacked the full measure of love, devotion, and this cheerful faith that characterized true discipleship.
So I think this really highlights like a key distinction, right, between obedience and surrender. On the surface, they both look like doing what's asked, but it seems like there's a world of difference in the underlying motivation, in the internal
Yeah,
state.
internal. Exactly. Yeah. Obedience is at its core an action. We might choose to obey for various reasons, love, respect, duty, even sometimes fear or desire for personal gain. But surrender is a state of being. It arises from a place of pure love, completely free from the weight of fear or any kind of external pressures. So in both obedience and surrender, the outward action might be identical, but
Yeah.
the internal landscape, the why behind the what, is vastly different.
Right. It's not just about like checking off a box on a to-do list. It's about like the inner attitude, the intention that fuels the action.
Exactly, yeah.
And you mentioned that there's actually a connection between the two. Like, how can the act of obedience potentially lead to this deeper state of surrender?
I think of obedience as the initial steps you take on a path. And through consistent acts of obedience, particularly when it's guided by a sense of higher purpose, you gradually begin to empty yourself of ego, attachments to your own way of doing things, your own selfish desires. And this emptying process creates space within for deeper qualities like love and faith to take root and grow. So obedience, when it's practiced sincerely and with intention, can become a transformative journey that ultimately culminates in surrender. It's like like training wheels for the spirit, helping you to let go of your own will.
I love that image. It's like consistently exercising a muscle. You're building up that strength of surrender over time. Now, you also mentioned a specific term for this elevated state of surrender, sharan. What does that truly signify?
Yeah, sharan is a profound spiritual state that signifies taking complete refuge. So imagine, a fish living completely within the vast ocean. It's utterly dependent on the ocean. It completely trusts in its support. That's the essence of sharan. And reaching this state involves an unconditional giving up of your individual will to the inner master, to this guiding wisdom within, and you transcend the limitations of ego, the attachments to the sense of me and mine. It's a state of profound trust and reliance on something greater than yourself.
So it sounds like a complete dissolving of the individual sense of self.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a powerful expression that captures the essence of this. It's you alone exist, I do not. And this signifies the ultimate realization that one's limited individual identity merges with a higher reality. So
Yeah.
it's a profound state of unity where personal will is completely aligned with a greater purpose and trust is absolute.
That's a really, really powerful image to hold in mind. Now, how does this play out in practical terms? Like, what does it actually look like to surrender to this? You called it the master's will, right?
Yeah, yeah. There's an analogy that's often used to illustrate this. So if the master looks at the sun and declares it to be the moon, the truly surrendered disciple agrees without a second thought. And the crucial element here is without a thought. It's not about intellectual agreement. It's not about trying to rationalize it. It's a complete absence of hesitation, questioning, or internal resistance. It's a deep acceptance that transcends logic.
Wow. That's a pretty radical level of trust. It goes way beyond just like, following instructions. It implies like a complete alignment of your perception with the master's perception. But isn't there a potential pitfall there? Like, how do you reconcile this kind of unquestioning agreement with the importance of, critical thinking in other areas of life?
Yeah, that's a very insightful question. Understanding the master's will, it's not about intellectual comprehension in the way that we usually understand it with our minds. It's about cultivating an inner sensitivity. It's about aligning our actions with fundamental ethical principles and a spirit of selfless service. So think of it less as, receiving literal commands and more as tuning into a higher frequency of wisdom and truth. And this often involves rising above the limitations of the rational mind and the worldly illusions, what some traditions call Maya, that can cloud our perception. It's about purifying the inner being and aligning with a higher purpose that resonates with your deepest self.
So how do you even begin to cultivate this kind of like profound surrender in your own life? What are some initial steps?
Well, the primary means is through dedicated inner reflection and contemplation. True surrender, especially the deep surrender of the ego that we've been discussing, is exceptionally rare without without consistent spiritual practice that quiets the constant chatter of the mind. So, intellectual acknowledgments of surrender, they're different from the genuine inner transformation that occurs through dedicated practice and self-inquiry. So it's about consistently turning your attention inward.
So that brings up a really important distinction. Are there different ways or levels of engaging with surrender in your life? You mentioned outer and inner surrender. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. Yeah, there are two key levels to consider. So outer surrender involves your daily actions and practices. So consistent meditation, consciously aligning your life with ethical principles that resonate with you, and following the guidance that you receive from trusted sources. Think of it as the tangible, practical application of your intention to surrender in your everyday life.
Right, so these are like the active steps that you consciously take. And what about inner surrender then?
So inner surrender, or sharan, as we discussed, is the deeper, more fundamental, and often unconditional level of surrender. It's when you begin to truly recognize the master within, that guiding wisdom within yourself. You start to release your attachment to a limited sense of self, and you increasingly align with that higher will and a sense of universal love. So outer surrender serves as the path, the consistent effort that helps you to gradually attain this more profound inner state of being. So practically, outer surrender might be committing to a daily practice of reflection, while inner surrender is the deeper shift in your sense of self and your connection to something larger that arises from that consistent practice.
It sounds like a continuous, like a lifelong journey, moving from those like deliberate acts of aligning your actions towards like a more natural, inherent state of being.
Now, how does selfless service, or seva as it's often called, how does that play into this whole process of cultivating surrender? Seva is an incredibly powerful vehicle for cultivating surrender. When you approach tasks and interactions with a spirit of selfless service, consciously acting as an agent of a higher purpose rather than for personal gain or recognition, it really supports your progress towards inner surrender. It naturally shifts the focus away from the ego and towards the service itself and the well-being of others.
You mentioned a really insightful story about a young, overwhelmed volunteer. Could you share that to illustrate this point?
Yeah, so this young person was given a significant responsibility within a service context, and they felt completely inadequate and overwhelmed by the task. And an experienced volunteer noticed their distress and offered this piece of simple yet profound advice: take yourself out of it. He is the one who does the seva. Think of yourself simply as his agent.
Wow, that's a really powerful shift in perspective. It's about like consciously detaching from the ego's inherent need for like control or personal validation through the service.
Exactly, yeah. And there's a core teaching that resonates with this, which is, I am nothing. All is Satguru's work. I am merely an instrument. And, when you operate under the belief that you are the primary doer, ego naturally arises, whether it manifests as pride in your achievements or feelings of inadequacy when things don't go as planned. Both of those spring from that central sense of I. True Sava involves intentionally forgetting your perceived talents, your abilities, your shortcomings, your imperfections, and simply seeing yourself as a willing instrument through which a greater purpose can work.
So it's about being like a conduit rather than the originator. There's beautiful analogy that captures this idea, isn't there?
Yeah, the analogy of being a little pencil in God's hands. So the pencil itself, it doesn't decide what to write or how to write it. It's guided entirely by the hand that holds it. Similarly, in the context of seva, you become an instrument through which a higher will operates without your ego kind of dictating the process or claiming ownership of the outcome.
Right. So it's about like consciously disconnecting from like the specific outcome of the service, allowing the work to be done through you rather than, being driven by your own like personal agenda or expectations.
Exactly, yeah. It's a fascinating paradox. You need to be fully present and actively engaged in the seva, yet you also need to consciously let go the ego-driven need to control or take personal credit. And when that sense of I becomes central to your seva, that's often when feelings of stress, worry, and fatigue arise because you feel personally and solely responsible for everything.
That makes a lot of sense. Like when you feel like the entire weight of the task rests on your shoulders,
Yeah.
it's so easy to get bogged down.
Yeah, there's a perspective that suggests that worry in the context of seva actually indicates a lack of complete faith in that higher guidance that we've been talking about. And the assurance is that when you genuinely surrender the outcome and your sense of being the sole doer, help and support arrive in ways that you might not expect. But it's crucial to truly hand over the responsibility, not just superficially say you have while still being internally preoccupied with every detail.
So it's about a genuine release of that mental and emotional burden, right?
Yeah.
You also mentioned, this powerful idea about not being able to progress while carrying unnecessary weight.
Yeah, there's this powerful image of not being able to ascend to higher spiritual states if you're burdened by unnecessary emotional and mental baggage, the weight of ego, worry, attachment to outcomes. And engaging in physical seva under guidance, this becomes a practical training ground for discerning the subtle difference between your own willfulness and a higher will at play. And consciously following instructions and engaging in inner reflection, these help you to increasingly step into alignment with that higher will.
So it's through these like tangible acts of seva performed with the right inner attitude
Yeah.
that you gradually learn to align yourself with this greater purpose.
Exactly, yeah. When you perform physical seva with humility, submission to guidance, and a spirit of love, it allows that higher power to work through you more effectively, essentially making you a conscious coworker in a larger design. It's a dynamic interplay between your willing participation and a more expansive guidance.
That's beautiful. And seva also like naturally presents you with so many opportunities to cultivate another crucial element for surrender, acceptance. Can you share some examples of how that might manifest?
Sure. So within the context of seva, you might be asked to perform tasks that you don't personally prefer. For instance, someone with accounting skills might be asked to help with cleaning, or, your requests for involvement in specific seva activities might be delayed, or they might not materialize as you expected. Sometimes you might even be asked to redo work that you've already put, significant effort into, like, an architect having their designs revised multiple times. So these everyday situations within seva become invaluable opportunities to practice acceptance.
Right. It's about intentionally letting go of your personal preferences and preconceived expectations about how things should unfold.
Exactly, yeah. And think back to that earlier story of the disciple cheerfully rebuilding the mud platform 70 times. That serves as a powerful example of accepting what unfolds without resistance or resentment. Ultimately, all forms of seva are valuable in their own way, and learning to accept the circumstances and tasks with an open heart and a positive attitude is absolutely key. The challenging times that you encounter in seva are not necessarily obstacles, but rather integral parts of the process designed to mold and transform you.
Wow. So the difficulties that you might face, they're not roadblocks on the path. They're actually essential elements of the path itself.
Right. Exactly, yeah. As your inner awareness grows, your tendency to make judgments about what constitutes good or bad seva, this begins to diminish. You gradually stop comparing your experiences to those of others, and you recognize that all situations and all the people involved are in a way instruments for your own learning and growth. And there's a teaching that encourages us to not be unduly affected by changes in external circumstances, not to be elated in one situation and disheartened in another, but to see it all as part of a larger benevolent design.
That's a huge shift in perspective to view everything that happens as intentional and ultimately purposeful.
It is, yeah. And over time, even your judgments about fellow volunteers or those you're serving, these tend to lessen as you realize that everyone is playing a role in the unfolding process. Difficult interactions can be seen as tests of your own humility, patience, and capacity for love. Ultimately, the desire to avoid challenging situations, this begins to evaporate as you develop a deeper trust that any challenges you face are within your ability to handle with the guidance and grace that are available to you. So the aim is to cultivate a state of contentment and acceptance of whatever comes your way, even when it doesn't fully align with your understanding or preferences.
There's a really profound quote that speaks to this idea of everything taking on a different quality when viewed through this lens of acceptance.
Yeah, the quote is, "If you can take what comes to you through him, then whatever it is, it becomes divine in itself. Everything takes its flavor from God and turns divine." So this really underscores the transformative power of embracing acceptance in all circumstances.
That is so powerful. You also shared, this wonderful anecdote about a heavy downpour at a gathering and the remarkably calm coordinator. I think that story really brings this principle into vivid action.
Yeah, so this was a situation where a large gathering was suddenly disrupted by torrential rain, creating a scene that appeared quite chaotic and stressful. Yet, amidst all the frantic activity and concern, the individual coordinating the event, they remained remarkably calm, even displaying a sense of inner peace and joy.
So what was their perspective that allowed them to maintain that kind of equanimity in the face of like apparent chaos?
Well, the coordinator explained that they wouldn't be feeling so peaceful if they believed they were the ones solely responsible for managing the situation. They operated under the conviction that they were simply acting as an instrument of a higher will. And they expressed their belief that the master was providing the necessary direction, putting words in their mouth and guiding all the efforts that were being made. And the coordinator had this deep faith that everything would ultimately come together as needed, even without having a clear understanding of exactly how.
Wow. So that really captures like the essence of surrender that we've been discussing. It's about like consciously relinquishing personal control and placing your trust in a larger orchestration.
Exactly, yeah. There's a saying that beautifully encapsulates this. Paul too sleeps carefree, the Lord himself is his watchman. So while the outcomes might not always align perfectly with your personal preferences, consistently giving your best effort, keeping that higher guidance in mind, accepting whatever unfolds and acting as a willing agent, this shifts the burden of responsibility and brings a profound sense of inner freedom.
That's so freeing just to think about. So what are some of the broader benefits that come from like consistently striving for this state of surrender, particularly within the context of selfless service? Like how does it impact your life beyond those specific acts?
Well, the consistent effort to cultivate surrender in Seva, it creates a lasting and profound impact on your inner landscape, influencing how you perceive and respond to all events in your worldly life. You begin to view both positive and negative experiences with greater equanimity, recognizing them as opportunities for growth and as part of a larger unfolding process. You increasingly recognize a guiding hand in all aspects of your life, which naturally reduces internal struggle and fosters a deeper sense of acceptance.
So it sounds like it cultivates like a very deep and abiding sense of inner peace.
It does, yeah. By consciously taking the focus of self out of your actions and dedicating them to a higher purpose, you cultivate a profound inner peace and calmness that also significantly aids your inner reflection and contemplation. Ultimately, it becomes a beautiful, gradual, and lifelong process of surrendering to love and trust.
And this path of surrender, as we've explored it, it's deeply connected to like a fundamental human quest, right? The search for truth.
It is, yeah. This is considered a direct path toward truth, to live in increasing alignment with a higher will through both conscious obedience to ethical principles and a deep inner surrender. And there's a fundamental question that's often asked, which is how do we attain truth and dispel inner illusions? And the answer lies in consciously aligning with and surrendering to that higher wisdom.
So finally, in considering this path, what would you say is the alternative to choosing this path of surrender that we've been discussing? What happens if one doesn't consciously choose this?
Well, the alternative, in a sense, is to inadvertently surrender to other, often less fulfilling forces. The constantly shifting whims of your own mind, the fleeting allure of worldly pleasures, or even the potentially ego-driven dictates of another person's limited perspective. But for those who have glimpsed the deeper peace and purpose that comes with conscious surrender to a higher principle, these other alternatives often lose their previous hold.
It's like once you've tasted something truly fulfilling, the superficial substitutes no longer satisfy.
Exactly, yeah. There's an analogy of an item that has been sold in a shop. It might still be on display, but it's no longer available for purchase. Similarly, once you make a genuine commitment to this path of selfless service and surrender to a higher will, the pull of other less meaningful desires gradually diminishes.
This has been such an enlightening deep dive into this profound concept of surrender. So to recap, we've explored the crucial yet often subtle difference between obedience and surrender, the vital role the consistent, outward effort plays in cultivating a deeper inner surrender, and the transformative power that this state of surrender can bring to selfless service and to your life as a whole.
Yeah, and hopefully, as you've been listening, you've been reflecting on your own understanding and personal practice of surrender in your daily life, regardless of your specific beliefs or background. And the principles we've discussed, they offer valuable insights that you can apply to navigate the challenges and opportunities in your own life with greater peace, clarity, and trust.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. In what specific areas of your life might cultivating a deeper sense of surrender bring about greater freedom and inner peace. What are some of the metaphorical weights that you might be carrying? Perhaps the need for control, attachment to specific outcomes, or resistance to what is that could be lightened by consciously shifting your perspective and placing your trust in a larger unfolding. That concludes our deep dive for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.